So last time, both of you, Sidi Talha and Sheha Bashir, you said you wanted to continue the last question I asked. And that, combined with what you were talking about earlier, not to get into the politics so much of it, but what can spiritual individuals and spiritual communities do to get the ball rolling for some sort of positive change in the US?
Well, I think they need to take what action they can. And that would involve participating in the culture, maybe belonging to or supporting groups or causes that foster what they see to be an inclusive rather than a divisive opinion. And speaking out when they can. I don't mean necessarily in public, but certainly in private, about what values are.
Well,
but I think, you know, sitting on the sideline and criticizing the mess isn't particularly helpful.
Well, I think
there's a place for it.
Yeah, to the extent we live in the world, we should orient ourselves to whatever good or better we can find.
Right? Anyone else?
I'm trying to figure out what was the question that you discussed last time, because I wasn't here. Was it the first one on the list from today?
It was the first one on the list from today, the last one on the last time.
Well, the short answer is a lot. A lot can be done, but I think there are so many communities around claiming to do good, but ultimately that community has to reflect the change within themselves first.
Yeah.
You know, if they're going out with an agenda of doing good and promoting good in the society, they first have to manifest that within themselves and within that community that's going to go out and do this good work.
Right. They actually have to have something to share other than talking points.
Right.
Is this not Gandhi's principle about be the change you seek?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You wish to see, yeah. But it's also, you know, get the beam out of thine own eye before you address the speck in your neighbor's, the mote in your neighbor's. You kind of have to ask yourself, you know, am I really up to the task? Am I really, I mean, I don't have to be perfect or completely righteous in every way, but one has to consider that.
No, you can't hold that as a standard for yourself or anyone.
Right, right. But you can take stock and decide if you're, you know, really able to communicate or model behavior or whatever before you go out and change the world. But you can always go out and love your neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it's actually the little things that go a long way. If, like you said, to go out and check on your neighbor is one of them.
Yeah.
You know, I think this recent article from a friend of mine, the ending of it, if you don't mind, I'll read the last two paragraphs because I think he has an answer for us.
All right. I don't mind. Okay.
Guénot's musings on historical cycles and his frank analysis of the dissolution of the times brings a kind of astringent clarity to the current cultural craziness. Together, Guénot and Baudrillot force us to see that this pervasive unreality, this sense of being marooned far from the truth, is the tenor of the times we find ourselves living in, and there is no going back. It is part of a historical cycle, and that cycle won't be altered by any of us, how much ever we scream at each other. The human spirit, like water, will find the level of its time. This is how it must be. The only question worth asking in times like these is how should we live? That in turn makes it clear that how and when and whether we engage with that cycle is largely our choice. It could be even that engaging with it at all is a trap. But if what we are witnessing is not at heart a political or cultural battle, but some manifestation of a spiritual battle, well, then perhaps our time should be spent becoming the right kind of warrior, because everything is currently set up to turn us into the wrong kind. The right kind of warrior takes his or her internal demons and fights them before he or she sails out to take on those of others. This person takes his stand and stands his ground without giving in to the nihilism of the age. He cleaves to what he believes in without falling into the traps laid by partisanship, anger, and self-righteousness. Most of all, he works to clear out his own inner junkyard so that he can go searching for truth and recognize it when he finds it. His war is against the worst of himself and for the best of the world, and what he is fighting for is the life that he so often fails at. His most effective weapon is sacrifice. This is easier written than practiced, of course, but I think it might be the way through. No one is obliged to take part in the spiritual crisis of a society, wrote the philosopher Eric Vogelin. On the contrary, everyone is obliged to avoid the folly and live his life in order. If there is better advice for living through the reign of quantity or surviving the hyper-real cultural wars, I haven't found it yet.
That's pretty good.
Yes, good indeed.
So, next question. What for you is sin? What is sin's experiential definition? And what does it mean to you? I don't mean some philosophical idea of sin. I mean, what is actual practiced sin in your books? Because we hear so often, day in, day out, these legalistic definitions of sin, but thank God, really, the mystics don't talk about it much, but clearly all of the Western religions have some concept of sin. What is it in your books?
Well, Sheikh Isa has a pretty good definition of sin. He defines it as error carried into action.
Yeah.
So also a sin would be a thought or action which does not serve the good of the whole.
Well, I don't know if the whole needs to be served, but I know what you mean. But you know that sometimes I think maybe it's not so important to figure out what sin is, but to make sure you have a conscience. Because that's how one should discern sin.
I mean, as long as you're asking the question, it's helpful.
What question?
Is this sin? Am I sinning?
Well, yeah, or experientially learning that acting out a certain feeling or whatever, produces negative results. Conscience will let you know that, even though you may have to take a few, you may have to miss it a few times. But in the process, you refine your conscience. You could almost say sin is thinking you're justified. I mean, I'm right and everybody else is wrong. I would have to say that that's teetering on the edge of sin if it's not falling in. Sin really is to miss the mark. It really just means that you either didn't see something or you failed in your response to it. It really isn't all that moralistic and shame-filled. It's something not to do again.
Yes.
I have two very simple definitions of sin. One is to do anything that puts you at odds with the real, capital R.
Yeah.
And two would be to do anything that's against your nature. And I think I really like that definition, because a lion kills, but it's in its nature to kill. So it's not sinning by killing, and it never kills more than it needs. The problem with humans and why they tend to sin is they go above and beyond what their nature dictates, and that is itself a sin. We have a certain human nature. To go against that is to sin. There's also certain principles in the world, I think, one of them is prayer. Look to any religion pretty much outside of perhaps Buddhism, and one thing you'll find is it's saying everything prays. Even the trees pray. But yet, when you go against that and say, no, there's no real, let's not even say God, there's no real, I'm the real, I am God. Not in the way Halaj said it, but in a hubristic, narcissistic way. That is a sin.
Well, for sure.
Well, I think my original definition was very close to yours about something that did not serve the real.
Right.
Yeah. Or reflect it. Or something like that.
Yes.
It's the orientation to the real is a big help in having the behavior that comes forth not be sinful. We just make a lot of mistakes because we don't know, and to a great extent because we don't know ourselves.
All right, so the next question, I thought of this one while I was listening to your Eid address, Sheikh al-Bashir, and it's, the police sirens were going off and everything, and I'm like, all right, not how do you find peace and silence in general, but how do you find peace and silence here and now within the confines of daily life?
Well, first I have to remember that it's available. And a lot of times I don't avail myself of the inherent peace and silence within because I've gotten too attached to, other things that are going on. And I don't feel I can let go of those things and sink into, peace and silence. But it's there. It's always there. And it doesn't depend on daily life, although daily life can provide plenty of distractions from remembering it. But it is in principle right there in everyday life. Don't you think?
Sheikh al-Bashir?
Well, state the question one more time.
How do you find peace and silence within the contents of daily life? I think Sidi Talha answered that it exists, but I'm not sure that we've come to a answer to the question in terms of how do you find it?
Well, I think you find it by knowing that it's always there in principle. And it is that peace that's beyond our activity and busyness. And if one can step back, even in the middle of doing something, one can find that peace and centeredness.
Right, that's true.
And I once said to a spiritual teacher, yes, finding that peace and centeredness is good, but not, but it's difficult when you're in the flow of life and things are happening and you're moving along with the flux to try to do that. And her response was to say, that isn't true. That's just something that you've taught yourself to believe. It's available all the time.
The problem is that we won't let go of that, which is distracting
exactly
ourselves
right.
from it.
That's exactly right. So then it's a matter of simply, he says, stepping back.
Yeah.
Not confusing what you do with what you are.
Yeah, exactly. That peace and silence has to do with being, not doing.
Right. Here. And yes, and maybe simple enough to say, focus on being, not doing.
Yeah. What is in spite of what's happening. I mean, if you recognize that you're disturbed and everything, stepping back is exactly right. It's what's going on here that is hiding the peace from me, and what can I do or not do in order that isn't happening?
Mm-hmm.
And usually it's just a question of being able to let go of yourself, because the voice in our head really is a constant self-justifier. The next thought often justifies the thought you just had. And if you want the peace and silence, you have to take your attention away from the noise and let it settle in the peace.
And let's forget for a moment the noise and focus on the peace. What if the thing that you're trying to find refuge from isn't necessarily something external, but something internal? What if it's something going on inside of you that's preventing you from peace? Worries or anxiety or something like that. Is the process the same, or is it different?
Yeah, the process is the same. If you find that certain modes of thought or emotional habits are spiritually disadvantageous, you have to, detach from them. The only reason they have any power over us is the attachment we have to them.
Yes, attachment.
Yeah, and thoughts, after all, although we feel like they happen within
attachment and thought. That sounds like that's attachment and thought. That sounds like a recent mudakara.
Oh, imagine that. Well, yeah, thought is more external than we initially think it is. We tend to identify with it. Think it's ourselves, but it's another phenomenon that goes on, often whether we want it to or not.
Yes, well said. It's something we take to be more real than it is.
Right.
I like this line from Lawrence when he says, when men and women, lads and girls are not thinking, when they are pure, which means they are quite clean from self-consciousness and egoism, either in anger or tenderness or desire or sadness or wonder or mere stillness, you may see the glimpses of the gods in them.
That's nice. Yes.
Yeah.
I sort of relate that to the hadith where Muhammad says that if someone spends enough time in prayer, that the point of the forehead where they're doing the sujood, it becomes bright, and shiny like a mirror. And I think about that, and that's the place of the third eye. And I think, if you actually cease from thinking, not ceasing from thinking in the sense that you become an idiot or you just follow along with whatever someone tells you, but that you achieve some sort of stillness and get beyond thinking, that you have a certain gleam. And there's not many times that I can say this, but like when I've seen someone that truly, has reached that state of, and sometimes it's not just a perpetual illumination, but temporary, but someone that's like able to have that stillness right here and now. Whatever their physical appearance may be, they have a certain radiance about them. And one person that definitely had that every time I met with him was the late Sheikh Bawa Muhayyiddin. Not
What
sure
a
if any
great-
of you ever had the chance to meet him. The Sri Lankan vegetarian Sufi sheikh who has a temple in Philadelphia.
Well, I know the name, but I guess I wasn't sure if I was contemporary with him, whether it was a historical figure or a current figure. He's historical now.
No, he passed away a few years ago, but yeah, he was alive during the last few decades.
Right. Well, that's great. There are such people, and they do remind us and give us a point of reference to help us remind ourselves later.
And one thing that's interesting, because I'm writing this book, and a lot is commenting on stuff that Lawrence wrote. And one of the things that I find very interesting is in all of the books that are talking about him, whether the person is vociferously in favor of him or very, very strongly against him, everyone that met him said the same thing, that when they looked at him, it was like they were looking at someone that saw the real or the divine. And, I think we have people among us that have done that. And, and we should honor and respect it in ourselves when we have those moments. Because
right.
They don't happen all the time. And when they do, even if it's for a split second, that moment is worth all those thousands of other moments. The moments where we're busy or we're like running on automatic mode. When we have that moment where we feel at peace and we feel like time has stopped and we know what is what, and we just simply are at peace there, and that is worth everything. And it's interesting, there's this Anglican priest and great author, Theodore Powers, who wrote this book, Mr. Weston's Good Wine, about God who takes human form and drives a Ford van into a British town and is offering people this wine that essentially is a symbol for the peace that passeth all understanding. And all of the people are like, I don't want that, and it got me thinking, if let's say you could go up to someone and offer them this peace, I wonder how many people would say, I actually don't want that.
Yeah. Some people would think it's irresponsible and lazy, an escapist.
Well, anyway, I'm going to skip 4 and come back to it later because I want to ask 5. And 4 and 6 are related. And that's, what are the advantages and disadvantages of invocatory phrases versus single word invocations?
The jewel in the harp, that single point of focus of a single word has its advantages, but there's clearly a place for the phrase.
I'm thinking one thing that's interesting is, how different religious groups invoke. The Catholics that use rosaries will often say the Lord's Prayer or Hail Marys, whereas the Orthodox, it's the Jesus Prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Whereas most Muslims aren't going to be saying the Shahada, they'll just be saying either Allah or La ilaha illallah. And I was just wondering, is there a sweet spot for that in daily life? Is there a time of the day that one is better? Is there a time that's better to say the full Shahada or something much longer, or versus the just La ilaha illallah or Allah? I mean, this I think is an important practical question for people, because there are those different options out there, and I think I'm curious with both of you, with all of your experience, what is the best for someone?
Well, it's not always the same. There are some things that you want to enter into that may be a phrase, like the Shahada, and they sort of work in conjunction with your mind. But the divine name, for instance, has no meaning outside itself, and that's its particular value. And there are times where you can do one more easily than the other, and that's something worth considering. Either one is better than neither, right?
Either one's better than neither, but I was just thinking in terms of practical advice, like if there's a certain moments that one would, in general, maybe work better than another, or certain situations.
Well, I think the single word, if you feel that you have to go into the center, or for that matter, even expand into the infinite, that there's nothing but that in which it happens. And the phrases sort of tell a little story, and whatever it is they say, you can repose in. But I think for concentration, I think the single word is better.
And do you think that there's a mystical significance to a word in the original language? So, for instance, most Christians will say things, even Orthodox Christians will invoke using English, if English is their native language.
Sure.
Whereas Buddhists, Pure Land Buddhists or whatnot, will say Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, and Muslims will say it in Arabic. Is there advantage to one or the other? Because on the one hand, with saying it in your native language, it's you know exactly what you're saying. On the other hand, going back to ancient ideas about words having mystical and magical meanings, like, do you lose something by saying things with different sounds and syllables?
Both are true. That's why it's such an issue.
But
Clearly,
if you say something in its original language, then you're acknowledging there's something more to it. There's something more to it, that the implication that the original language expresses it better keeps one from, thinking you've got it all figured out.
well, but on the one hand, one wants to know what one is saying.
Yes.
That's only reasonable. But to the contrary, some of the ancient languages are stated in a form of poetry that have a rhythm and a cadence that is a part of the message.
Yes. That's right. But I don't think there's no absolute there. It really is, there's not absolute much of anywhere really, but.
There's something about that phrase, touches of absolute.
Yeah, like truthiness. Is that touch of expression similar to truthiness, which is a word made popular by Stephen Colbert. Maybe you don't know it, but it's a good word. It's not profound. Anyway, enough, forget that.
Well, the other one I wanted to ask is, almost every tradition other than Islam primarily invokes not God or the real, but some sort of manifestation or incarnation of the divine. And very often, I think that does make it more relatable. It's perhaps much easier to see an icon of Jesus and invoke the name of Jesus than to invoke, let's say, Allah without, form. There's because
no form.
You said Allah has no meaning outside of its meaning.
Yes.
And I was wondering, what do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of that?
Wait, of what?
Yeah, of what?
Of the fact that Islam doesn't invoke any sort of manifestation or incarnation divine, but rather something beyond manifestation or incarnation, which certainly makes, relatability and certain practices where you can picture, let's say, the divine much more difficult. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were about that, since Islam is so different and unique in that it focuses on the source of manifestation rather than the manifestation.
Well, I mean, it's still form, but it's a form that the formless takes. I mean, it's I don't know. I mean, I think religions are sort of organic wholes, and I think, if a religion uses or makes a place for a good devotional and Gnostic place for some of these things, then it's fine. And there's something about having an incarnation, referring to an incarnation, to make God a little more immanent. So, I don't know which is better.
Oh, I'm not saying which is better or worse. I'm just talking about disadvantages and advantages for the practitioner. But of course, we can all agree that they're both good.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I don't have a lot of experience with those phrases that reference forms of the divine, but they're obviously legitimate. And Islam takes a kind of, transcendent absolute insisting upon God, with regard to everything. And it may go along, the lack of incarnation is important to Islam to maintain the transcendence. Now, one can have immanence in one's own experience, but you don't have to have it in doctrine as incarnations or whatever. Not in Islam, anyway. There may be a reason to have it in others.
I do think Islam has, at least current Islam, has a transcendence problem. I do think that a lot of religion today needs to, accept the reality of the immanence of God.
Yes.
Yes, indeed.
So you mean it has a transcendence problem in that it de-emphasizes immanence too much?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. I can. Yeah. I mean, there are strong points that some religions have and that other religions don't, but they have another strong point. But I think if you think about emerging from idol worship, focusing on the transcendent is probably a good thing.
And since all religions have advantages and disadvantages, why shouldn't we all just be syncretists?
Well, we can to a certain extent. It's just that you can't confuse one religion for the other.
It's a little hard to practice.
Yes, I mean, But you can have a relationship with lots of different spiritual forms, but they're intelligible only from a certain point of view. If you can take that point of view and see it and appreciate it, well, alhamdulillah. You know, that doesn't mean that you have to form an amalgam of religions and call it a religion. I think you need to know that you're moving between worlds, as it were. I mean, I find at least the, I guess, Syrian Orthodox liturgy just incredibly beautiful. And I really feel a sense of, you know, immanence and holiness. And I love it, but I don't try to mix it with Islam. It's just another experience I can have. If it feeds you, eat it.
Okay.
That's good. But I do think that if someone too ravenously consumes too many things from too many traditions without the right need or preparation, they can have something akin to spiritual obesity.
Yeah, or dispersion. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That's a risk.